In this video, I'm going to use some granulating watercolour paints. I've got a few hints and tips for you about working with granulating paints, and I'll show you how I used one of the Schmincke super granulating sets when I painted this Lioness. So what are granulating paints? Quite simply, they contain pigments that separate and settle into particles as they dry. These particles create a textured or grainy appearance on the paper, which helps to add interest to your painting. The granulating effect occurs because the pigments used have different densities or particle sizes. As the paint dries, the heavier or larger particles settle in the texture of the paper, while the lighter or smaller particles remain on the surface, resulting in a granular or speckled looking pattern. Here's a tip. The granulation is enhanced when you work on wet paper. How can you tell whether a pigment is granulating or not? The easiest way I have found is to use the colour charts that the paint manufacturers make. If you look at Schmincke's colour chart, you'll see a little capital G listed under the colour, which means that colour is granulating. This one here has got the G, so it's a granulating colour. Daniel Smith have a little Y or N written under their colour samples. Y stands for yes, it's a granulating colour, and N for no, it's not a granulating colour. Recently, Franz and Maggie from Jackson's in Australia sent me a set of Schmincke's super granulating colours. This is the Tundra Set, which has beautiful, earthy, natural looking colours inspired by the Arctic landscape. Each colour within this range is a blend of at least 2 granulating pigments. Aside from their amazing granulation properties, what I love about them is the way the colours separate when you apply them to the wet paper. This is my Winsor Newton visual diary. I've wet the paper, and this is the orange from the Tundra Set. The orange is a mixture of 3 pigments: potter's pink, maroon brown, and raw umber. As I mentioned, the granulation effect is enhanced when you work on wet paper, so that's why I've wet the paper here. This is the Tundra Pink, and this is made from 2 pigments, ultramarine and potter's pink. This is the Violet, which is a mixture of ultramarine and Mars brown. This one here is the Blue, which is ultramarine and maroon brown. And the green in the set is a mixture of Mars brown and cobalt green. Not only can you see the beautiful granulation that's occurring, but you can see how the colours are separating. And that is to be embraced because that makes your painting much more interesting when that happens. Here you can see the potter's pink separating from the earthy colours. As I mentioned, the granulation is enhanced on the wet paper. So here I'll paint the colours on the dry paper. So there is a slight granulation effect, but not as much as what it is on the wet paper. And the colours don't separate like they do on the wet paper. That colour separation on the wet paper is beautiful. Don't be frightened of that. That is one of the qualities that makes watercolour such a wonderful medium to use, and it really does enhance your paintings, which I will show you in this Lioness painting that I did using this set of Schmincke paints. I'm using cold press paper. I got my large flat brush and I wet the rock that the Lioness is lying on. Now I didn't wet all of the rock. I wet it in a sort of a random fashion, so I left some dry paper as well. I decided to paint the rock in really loosely, and I wanted to show the marks that the brush made as well. I used the Tundra Violet to paint the rock in, so that's a mixture of ultramarine and maroon brown. And I painted that straight onto the wet paper.
carefully underneath the Lioness. Straight away you can see the paint's starting to separate there as well. You can see the brown separating from the ultramarine. I've got my board on a slight angle as well, so it's not completely flat on the table. And as I said, I just used some loose and expressive marks when I painted the rock in. I wasn't trying to be too careful, and I used a brush that got the paint on there fairly quickly. I didn't want to fuss. So when my brush hits the dry paper, I get those hard edges, and when the paint is in the wet section, of course, I get the soft edges. And without really doing anything at all other than put the paint on the paper, you can see I've got that beautiful pigment separation there. To further enhance that, I picked up a bit of the orange and I painted that on here and there as well. I waited for the rock to dry and then I started painting the Lioness in. I worked on wet paper here as well. I used the orange from the set. This is a combination of 3 pigments. So, as I mentioned before, potter's pink, maroon brown, and raw umber. And I painted that on the wet paper as well. I used a large brush so that I could put the paint on there fairly quickly with as fewer brush strokes as possible, and to stop myself from fussing with it mainly. Straight away I could see the granulating effect happening. Down the bottom I dropped in a bit of the Tundra pink, just for interest. And for the darkest areas of the Lioness, I actually mixed some French ultramarine with burnt sienna. And I continued to work on the wet paper for almost all of the painting. There were a few areas where I worked on the dry paper. That was the orange, and here I've got a bit of the violet, just to cool that area down because it's in shadow. I wanted to include some little hairs inside the ear, so I used my eradicator brush here to take a bit of paint off, and the paint came off quite easily. It was easy to create those highlights with it. So I've got my brush wet and the paper's dry. On the paws, I used some grey that I mixed from French ultramarine and burnt sienna, but I probably could have used the violet here that I used on the rock. So here I'm coming in with the violet now. So this Tundra set features earthy and natural colours that are inspired by the Arctic landscape. Although it's intended for landscape painting, I decided to use them on this Lioness relaxing on the rock. Even though it wasn't a typical Arctic scene, the textures created by the granulating paints added depth to the Lioness's fur, and it made the painting more interesting. I used the violet on the background as well, but I painted it much heavier with more pigment, and I also layered it a few times. And then to add even more texture, I got my sea sponge out, I wet it with water, and then I patted it over the wet paint to remove a bit of paint. And that created some more texture on the background as well. This is the Tundra violet that I used on the background. And there is my finished painting. So I used 3 of the paints from the set and French ultramarine and burnt sienna as well. Prints of this painting are available on my website. I've put a link in the description. I hope you will embrace granulating paints.
These are really lovely to use. You can buy them individually or in sets like this. I'll link to them in the description. So just remember that granulation is enhanced on wet paper, also on textured paper more so than smooth paper. Thanks for watching. Please give the video a like. Let me know if you've used these granulating paints. Make sure you subscribe because it helps the channel and it encourages me to make these tutorials for you. I'll see you next week. Did I say it was a giraffe? It's not a giraffe, it's a lioness. It's a bit confusing. So what are granulating paints?
Can you do it again just in case?
What?
In case you said giraffe.
No, I was just saying it to you so you knew which video we were working on. It's not. Oh. Alright, I'll start again. I'll start again. Why this is not giving me any breaks. These are really lovely to use. You can buy them individually or in sets like this. I just probably should hold them up there. I hope you will embrace granulating. What?
Your hand was still moving before you finished.
Let me know if you've used these granulating paints, and
Could you go from where you...
I hope you will embrace granulating paints.
Can you do that again?
No.
Take the microphone off. Is it the thumbnail? Angle it more. Go that way.
Is that good?
Yeah, can you do the other side, maybe? I think move back a bit further. Go that way. Yeah, like that. Let's see.
Is it good?